To borrow a turn of phrase that you might be familiar with, the inconvenient truth is that we are not on track for a 2-degree world, let alone the 1.5 degree target that scientists generally agree is the upper limit of what we might be able to call safe. The 1.5 degree scenario is probably literally physically impossible at this point, particularly when we consider that aerosol pollution, largely from burning fossil fuels, is currently masking somewhere between about a half a degree of warming globally. And as we decarbonize, that warming is actually going to be realized. 2 degrees is probably not technically physically impossible, but is increasingly highly improbable in the current sort of political and geopolitical climate that we are in. In fact, the smart money now is betting on a 3-degree world, or potentially worse. Major banks are stress testing portfolios against these higher warming scenarios, and investors are long on HVAC stocks, predicting that climate goals will fail, but that air conditioning market will grow by 41%. Now, all of these future scenarios make generally very linear assumptions about things like the stability of natural carbon stores and what are called warming-induced emissions in key places like the Arctic tundra. But the more we overshoot that 1.5 degree scenario, the bigger the risks are of things like tipping points, feedback loops, and cascading systemic climate risks. We have grown accustomed to calling climate change a slow-motion disaster, but scientists have actually been warning us for decades that this will not always be the case. There are many different locally stable states for the planet, ranging from ice ages to the so-called hothouse Earth, where runaway ecosystem emissions of CO2 and methane create a dangerous feedback loop that could rapidly accelerate warming. Our emissions already are pushing us towards this future, and it's really far from clear whether we'll be able to get ourselves back on to that stable track. The fact is that our climate future is no longer linear. To bring this sort of closer to home, let's look at an example of this sort of nonlinearity in climate impacts right here in our community. In 2011, Hurricane Irene hit the New York area with a storm surge of about 1.5 meters. Existing flood infrastructure was able to handle the surge, and there was basically little damage. Just 1 year later, Hurricane Sandy hit with a 2.75 meter surge, which overwhelmed New York's flood infrastructure and caused an estimated $62 billion worth of damages across the region. Climate damages like this are also nonlinear. They're minimal until some threshold, and then they're exponential. Incidentally, it's worth noting that we expect an additional about 0.5 meter of sea level rise in the coming decades, and much more if our fears about ice sheet instabilities come true, or if the Atlantic currents that force warm water across the Atlantic weaken significantly. We are very definitely not prepared. Perhaps the ultimate nonlinear factor, though, when it comes to climate impacts, is vulnerability. I always like to say that storms aren't actually a disaster by themselves. Storm plus vulnerability equals disaster. And the fact is that poverty really is the pre-existing condition for just about every disaster that we see in the world. In New York, just like everywhere else, climate doesn't strike evenly. It hits the poorest first and worst. In New York City, low-income communities are far more likely to live in flood zones, lack insurance, and face months and sometimes years of delayed recovery from storms. More than 69,000 homes were damaged by Hurricane Sandy, many of them beyond repair. Thousands were left in the cold and dark, with no heating, power outages, and dangerous mold that some communities are actually still dealing with to this day. A lack of savings, insurance, and mobility seriously delayed recovery for the most vulnerable. Hurricane Sandy wasn't just a storm. It was a planning failure. The forecasts weren't enough. Early warning didn't lead to early action. Systems weren't ready for the cascading failures to flood and heat and power loss. Now, I also just want to point out that climate risks don't actually stay where they start. They move. Risk travels through people, through supply chains, and through markets. A flood in Honduras can become a housing crisis in the Bronx. A multi-year drought in eastern Syria can become a civil war in Damascus, a refugee crisis in Europe, and the biggest surge in right-wing populism since World War II. Global climate disruption drives local instability and poverty. Welcome to the age of tipping points. Compounding risks, irreversible change, runaway dynamics. Arctic sea ice loss will lead to accelerated regional warming and destabilize weather patterns, particularly in the northern hemisphere. Methane release from melting tundra could create a feedback loop of more and more warming. Accelerating melting in Greenland and Antarctica could lead to catastrophic levels of sea level rise. Slowdown in Atlantic currents could lead to devastating shifts in weather patterns and sea level rise right here on the eastern seaboard. The tipping points era demands a new kind of strategy for climate, one focused on risk reduction, not just emissions reduction. The question is no longer if we'll face catastrophic risks, but it's whether we'll have real options when we do. Reducing emissions is critical, and it must be accelerated. But at this point, it's really just table stakes. We need real strategies for harm reduction before disaster hits. Unfortunately, we don't really know what actions to take to mitigate these risks because our planning and our decision frameworks don't even incorporate them. Our tools are built for yesterday's climate, not for tomorrow's emergencies. Our infrastructure is not built for cascading failures. Our institutions are fragmented with little coordination across the components needed for resilience and recovery. Vulnerable communities that need planning and resilience the most are largely invisible from the models our decision makers use. And our planning tools generally leave out organizations like aid organizations and the people who actually know what's really at risk. Yes, we need better and earlier warnings, and AI is making great strides on that front. But what do we do with those warnings? Warnings need to trigger responses before disasters. Many studies have shown the value of anticipatory disaster response. More lives and livelihoods saved for lower costs than reactive response. Yet we almost never do it because our institutional models, particularly our finance models, are fundamentally reactive. Real action starts with reducing vulnerability. Remember, storms alone don't create disasters. But we also need new options for avoiding catastrophic risks at the source. And we need new institutions from the global to the local level that are grounded in science, integrated across sectors with the authority and resources to act. Okay, so I know at this point, everyone in the room is thinking, wow, I really want to invite him to my next dinner party because he really just is hilarious and really enlivens the mood. Fantastic. That's wonderful. And I appreciate that. And I welcome those invitations. But actually, this is actually not a talk about doom and gloom, despite the last 7 minutes. This is actually a talk about innovation and hope. I promise. So meet the ARC initiative. So ARC is a relatively new initiative of Renaissance Philanthropy that exists for one reason: to make sure that the world has safe, validated emergency options when climate systems start to break. ARC is a mission-driven platform that builds readiness for catastrophic climate risks. We back translational R&D for the highest consequence risks, but we don't do it alone. We do it with top scientists and with communities on the ground. We are currently focused on 4 big priorities. Sea level rise beyond about a half a meter that I mentioned, maybe a meter in wealthy countries that can afford better, expensive resilience strategies, would be absolutely catastrophic, perhaps even existentially catastrophic for human society as we know it. Unless we can literally make more seas, and yes, we are working on that, it has to be prevented at its source, the ice sheets at the poles, full stop. We cannot allow them to collapse. We also have to do everything we can to try and mitigate the severity and duration of that climate overshoot I was talking about. And this actually starts, interestingly enough, in the Arctic. The Arctic really is the canary in the coal mine of climate change. And yes, I get the irony of that metaphor, but it's warming literally 4 times faster than the global average. And scientists now expect that the Arctic will be completely ice-free in the summertime in as little as 10 years. Sea ice is highly reflective, but the ocean beneath it is dark, and it absorbs a lot more light and heat, which creates a dangerous feedback loop. As you lose sea ice, the ocean gets warmer and warmer, which creates more sea ice loss that exacerbates overshoot. Meanwhile, the tundra in the Arctic literally contains enough carbon to double or triple global warming all by itself. And the warming potential of the methane stored in that tundra is about 10 times worse than that. Even a fraction of that carbon or methane was released would devastate our hopes of that safe landing for the climate future. Now, the third priority area is the ocean. The ocean is the most important buffer that we have against climate. It absorbs 90% of the excess heat from climate change, and it absorbs 30% of the excess emissions from humans. But the oceans are nearing their limit. We need to protect ecosystems like coral and others, and we need to address the ocean carbon cycle, and we need to protect critical ocean circulations that quite literally make life possible in much of the world. Climate change will also make hurricanes worse. Sea level rise means bigger storm surges, and warmer temperatures means stronger storms that can carry more rainfall. And of course, we need to adapt societies to reduce vulnerability and protect lives, livelihoods, and ecosystems. Maybe I should have put the dinner joke after that slide. I apologize. That was not the uplifting part. So a few of our programs that we're working on in the ARC initiative. Can we imitate natural processes in order to stabilize ice sheets by refreezing them to the land? This is the key question being asked by the Erect Glacier Initiative. To answer it, we need new data and we need new models of glaciers. We're actually building some of those models as huge artificial glaciers in laboratories across the US. And then we're building digital glaciers as AI native models that leverage the increasing volume of data that's necessary to understand these complex systems. Our biggest concern is the Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica, which is pictured here. It's been dubbed the Doomsday Glacier, and if it collapses, sea levels would rise by 1 to 2 meters by itself. And the fear is that it would actually destabilize the larger West Antarctic ice sheet behind it, which could lead to even more sea level rise, like water world levels of sea level rise over the longer term. All right, can we safely cool the Arctic before critical systems spiral out of control? Many approaches have been proposed for this, from seeding Arctic clouds in winter to thin them to outgoing radiation, allowing more heat to escape, to thickening sea ice by pumping thin sheets of water over it in the winter, allowing it to freeze and become thicker so that it can last longer in the summer. Much work is needed to understand if these can be effective and safe, and time is running out. We're launching the Arctic Climate Emergency Response Initiative to drive more attention and capital to this important problem. This includes AI-powered monitoring and data assimilation to create multi-scale real-time models of Arctic clouds, ice, and tundra in order to design precision interventions and also to better understand the future of the Arctic. There is no silver bullet in the Arctic, or really anywhere else for that matter. We need to urgently conduct the research on the safety and feasibility of many approaches at once. Can we create new seas? See, I told you this was coming. I was not joking about that. It turns out that the answer is actually yes. In theory, we could create enough new seas to actually significantly reduce global sea level and mitigate the flood risk for hundreds of millions of people. Now, these would be big infrastructure projects, but the return on investment would be easily 1,000x or more. And the local benefits, from hydroelectric power generation to tourism to improve rainfall from microclimate effects and ecosystem health, make these projects what I like to call a twofer. Probably the most promising of these is the Qattara Depression in Western Egypt, which is pictured here. It used to be a sea, so it's actually not just a desert, but a salt desert. Literally nothing grows there. It's only 50 kilometers from the Mediterranean. and it would, by itself, would hold about 1,000 cubic kilometers of water. So we're working on that. Can we weaken hurricanes before they make landfall and devastate communities? Even a small reduction in hurricane intensity translates into a very large reduction in damage. We're looking into everything from hybrid coastal defenses to AI-powered precision cloud seeding to disrupt hurricane structure, to temporary ocean surface cooling to cut off hurricanes from their power source, creating a sort of speed bump that you can lay out before a hurricane makes landfall. We actually tried some of this stuff, specifically the cloud seeding in the 60s and 70s in the US. But we didn't have the monitoring and modeling to achieve the necessary precision that was needed and to verify that the interventions were having the desired effect. Thanks to advances in sensors, and particularly with AI and drones and other things, we believe now is the time to try again and to be able to do so precisely and responsibly. All right. Can we leverage AI to get deep insights about vulnerability, putting people at the center at resilience, and reimagine planning frameworks to account for complex cascading risks? Yes, we can, but it requires us to really rebuild the entire technology stack, which you've heard about a little bit this morning, the entire technology stack and decision frameworks, including how we think about planning and response. All right, so I want to be clear that most of this work is still in very early days. Most of these things are probably closer to science fiction than they are to science fact. But 10 years ago, pretty much everything we're talking about today was considered science fiction. Unfortunately, in this case, the default of the system is delay. Governments don't prioritize this research because there is no constituency for avoided catastrophe. We can't rely on industry because there's no profit in saving the Arctic. Frighteningly, actually, many countries and companies are preparing to make a profit from its demise. And many of these harm reduction strategies remain controversial. People say that if we mitigate the catastrophic risks, it creates a moral hazard, giving oil companies an excuse to keep extracting fossil fuels. 15 years ago, I was actually very sympathetic to that argument. But that ship has sailed. We're now in the era of tipping points, and there's simply too much at stake. We must prevent the irreversible harm while we still can, because delay is frankly not neutral. And check out our website, see the many other things we're working on at ARC, and reach out to me if you'd like to learn more. If you're going to be in London in a couple of weeks for London Climate Week, we're going to be doing a big event there on the 23rd that we'd love to have you at. And we're planning also a ton of exciting things for New York Climate Week as well. So, this is important. Including my annual Climate Week karaoke night that I do in New York every year, which I have been told is the most important networking event of all of New York Climate Week. So if nothing else, if you come away from this talk with nothing else, reach out to me about New York Climate Week karaoke night. Thanks, y'all.